Hey everyone, I'm David Scranton, and as you know, we all make mistakes, but some mistakes are more expensive than others. If you forget to water the lawn, for example, right, it's really no big deal in the grand scheme of things. But if you forget to pay your taxes, very big deal, right? And today we're talking about common mistakes that people make in retirement and how you can avoid these. It's that time again, time to tune out the hype and focus on the facts. Facts that matter to you, the income generation. Yes, financial mistakes can be costly in almost every sense of the word. And that's especially true when they occur during and while you're preparing for retirement. So today, we're going to be talking about some of the most common and harmful mistakes that you might make during and just before retirement. We're also going to explain how investing for income in many ways can help you avoid some of these mistakes. Things such as failing to identify your retirement goals, or putting too much trust in what I like to refer to as cookie cutter investment rules and strategies, and not understanding the difference between bonds and bond mutual funds. Or think about what happens if you underestimate inflation, or if you start spending down your principal early on in retirement. You see, a lot of these mistakes are connected, meaning that if you learn how to avoid one, you can avoid others. Conversely, if you make one, there's often a chain reaction. Of course, income specialist and best-selling author Jeff Small joins us again here today. And we're also going to be hearing from other income specialists based all around the country. And we'll be answering your retirement questions. But first, I want to talk about two common mistakes that people make, and they tend to do it for similar reasons. First, oftentimes folks don't identify their retirement goals. And second, they blindly follow a one-size-fits-all investment rule or strategy that doesn't really fit their needs. I find that to be surprising, frankly, how many people reach age 65 without having identified their retirement goals. And sometimes, though, there is a legitimate reason. Maybe you're just not planning to retire because you're happy with your job and you want to go on doing it for as long as you can. And that's okay. But on the other hand, you may just think that your general ideas about retirement are good enough. You want to have enough money to live comfortably without having to go back to work. And that's your retirement goal, case closed. Well, it's a good starting point, but that's all it really is a starting point. Why? Because in reality, you need to go deeper and you need to be as specific as you possibly can. For example, do you plan to move? And if so, to where? Do you want to travel? Do you want to buy a boat? Do you want to have a second home? And once you've answered these questions, your ability to create a more successful retirement plan for retirement increases tenfold. And as I pointed out before, everybody really wants the same thing from their investments in a laboratory type pure sense. And that is, you want maximum return with minimum risk. But once you've identified your goals, then you're able to answer a critical question. And that is maximum return for what purpose? And in terms of retirement, I find the answer falls into only one of three categories. First, you might want to take some money and use it to make a major purchase. You might want to buy a second home. You might want to buy a boat. Okay? Second, you might want to just leave a big legacy. That could be a major driver for you. Or number three, you might just want to have reliable retirement income. Well, if you're like most people that I talk to every day, and I believe we're going to find out these income specialists around the country talk with, the most common answer is probably door number three, to have reliable retirement income. Now, once you've identified your goals, now you can create a strategy designed to generate enough reliable income to meet those goals. One that's right for you, not cookie cutter. Which brings me to that second common mistake, is blindly following these one-size-fits-all investment rules that end up leading you to cookie cutter solutions that I find most likely probably don't align with your goals or be right for your situation. Since the earliest days of financial markets, analysts have tried to create easy, all-purpose guidelines for saving and investing. And unfortunately for investors, most of these are oversimplified, and therefore they haven't really kept pace with any social change or any economic change. And more importantly, when it comes to saving, investing for retirement, there's really no such thing as a one-size-fits-all solution, because your situation is uniquely your own, and so are your goals. So you need a strategy, and in most cases, an advisor that understands this. So before I welcome Jeff, let me take a minute to answer one of your questions on today's topic specifically. So Jim from Kentucky asks, Dave, what if you're over 60 and just not sure about your retirement goals yet? Great question. And I think the key to that is to realize that you need to do the best you can and realize that your goals are going to change. So if you're over 60, you sit down now and you take a day and you visualize what you think retirement will look like for you. Maybe you interview some people that you know that have retired, some that maybe retired and weren't so happy, and some that retired and were happy. So you kind of know what to stay away from and what to move toward. And as you interview people and you start to think about what you want, you sit down with a clean sheet of paper for an entire day with nobody around you, cell phone off, and you just write. And you stream of consciousness goal setting and think about all the things that you want to have, do, or become in retirement. And the more you write through this in a stream of consciousness way, the more you find these answers start to become clearer for you. Now, be sure to submit your own questions to Ask Dave at the link that you see on the screen. Now, let's talk with Jeff, president of Arbor Financial Services, a retirement income store located in Melbourne, Florida. Jeff, I can't believe it. I actually haven't talked to you or seen you in an entire week, and I have to commend you. You haven't aged a bit, my friend.
Yeah, what a tan you have, Dave. Look, you must have been getting some sun lately. Look at you. You look great.
Well, the tan, if you saw me a couple days ago, the tan would have been a sunburn. So you'd think at my age I would have learned my lesson, but I guess I haven't.
Well, let's get back to the topic of the show, which really is the opening was on goals. And so, when people retire, Dave, they really think they've hit their goal, but their goals are more important than ever. But you and I have both heard many times people have said, you know what, I'm not going to have any goals until I've saved enough money. Then I'll spell out my goals.
Jeff, it's interesting because you're right. Essentially, people end up getting it backward because what helps you achieve those goals, what helps you get to the income level generated from your investments that you want, is your ability to save and invest smartly, right? And there's a part of our brains, as you know, Jeff, called the reticular activating system. It's that unconscious part of the mind that when we're excited about a goal, we're moving toward it, all of a sudden we find opportunities that are going to help us get to that goal faster. And let's face it, saving money is not fun. It's hard work. It means sacrifice today. Well, again, if your unconscious mind knows the reason it's making those sacrifices and has a clear vision of what that's going to lead to in the future, all of a sudden it makes savings throughout your entire working career less painful and more pleasurable because you're moving toward something positive. Right after the break, we'll talk more about a common retirement mistake that people make, and frankly, most advisors actually recommend for people. And it's something that our next income specialist that we're going to be interviewing, Wes Wood, knows a lot about and knows to avoid. Stay with us. We'll be right back on the Income Generation. I'm David Scranton, and I'm with Jeff Small. Be back in a minute. I'm David Scranton. During my career, I found that most baby boomers have done a great job growing their retirement savings, yet many don't know how to convert their savings into steady income. And that is why I built the Retirement Income Store, to help hardworking Americans preserve their assets and establish steady streams of income.
If you're 55 or older, our free Retirement Income Kit is for you. It's chock full of information you need to know to get steady income during your retirement. Call 866-710-1749, online at theretirementinComestore.com.
Welcome back to the Income Generation. I'm David Scranton. I'm here with Jeff Small. And in a moment, we're going to have a special guest, Wes Wood, on the show. So it's great to be here today with all of you to talk about these most common mistakes and how you can avoid them. And so far, we've identified two that trip up retirees and near retirees. But we also noted that the reason some advisors push these cookie cutter rules of thumb and strategies is because some of the alternatives that might be more appropriate for your specific goals require them to have more knowledge and, frankly, to do a lot more work as compared to these cookie cutter approaches. And sadly, many advisors today lack the knowledge it takes to offer or to manage more conservative income generating strategies. So this brings up another common misunderstanding, and that's believing there's little or no difference between bonds and bond mutual funds. And if you really don't understand the difference, it's not really your fault. Why? As I said right before the break, many advisors, most of the financial media, want to believe there's very little difference, or even better, want you to believe that bond mutual funds are actually better than individual bond portfolios. But of course, you've watched many of our previous shows, I know, so you've heard me explain that there is a huge difference between the two. And I keep emphasizing this because it's so important once you're over the age of 50 and time is really not on your side anymore as it was earlier on in life. Because if you're invested entirely in growth-based strategies, for example, in your 30s or 40s, and the market takes a big dip, well, you still have time to recoup losses before retirement. But as you know, if you're in your 50s, well, you probably won't have that time. And that's generally why people look to lower the risk as they get older. But to truly lower your risk, you need to understand the risks of investing for growth as you age, as well as the differences between bonds and bond mutual funds. So here's the basic difference. When you invest in individual bonds, you get two important guarantees. Of course, assuming there's no defaults. First, you get a guaranteed dollar amount of an interest payment for the life of the bond. And second, you get a repayment of your principal when the bond matures. Now, by contrast, not only does a bond mutual fund lack these two guarantees, but it contains many of the risks of a stock mutual fund. In other words, put it simply, an individual bond is designed to generate income regardless of market conditions, while bond funds are not. So now let's get to another one of your questions. Donna from Florida says, are you saying that individual bonds are the main or the only thing I'd be invested in if I were investing for income? Well, Donna, great question, and the answer is certainly no. But bonds certainly are often a core of that portfolio. I often refer to the universe of bonds and bond-like instruments, which include other things. We talk about preferreds, we talk about BDCs, we even talk about real estate investment trusts, and so on and so forth. But also, especially today, there are some high dividend common stock opportunities for those who have the risk tolerance, are willing to take a little bit more risk, but still want income. Now, that income is more like the income on a bond fund because it's not contractual, but the difference is, at least with high dividend stock, you have some upside potential and some potential for the principal to go up and the income to go up. With a bond fund, you really don't have that. So if you're going to forfeit the guarantees with some of your money, which is fine, at least make sure you have some upside potential to reward you for those. And again, be sure to send me your retirement questions by emailing us at askdave@theretirementincomestore.com. Now, back to Jeff.
So Dave, we both hear about these mistakes a lot, but it's because we both see it a lot.
Yeah, well, we do, because we see people coming in, they say they have a conservative strategy, and then we find the advisor has them heavily in bond mutual funds. And they think it's conservative, the advisor thinks it's conservative. You and I and our next guest, Wes Wood, know otherwise.
Well, that's true, Dave, but it's like we always say, bond funds aren't really conservative. They're just they're just a more conservative end of an aggressive business model, and they don't really offer the level of protection most people need in retirement.
Yeah, that's right. You can ask a commercial airplane pilot if he's conservative or aggressive, and darn well, or you hope at least, he's going to say conservative, right? But you also know some people, some of your clients, Jeff, that are really, really conservative that would never even dream of getting a pilot's license because they view it as being too risky. So the thing is that the word conservative is just a word. It means different things to different people. So if you have a stock market-based business model and you're a financial advisor, then to you, bond funds are conservative. But you and I both know, as well as our next guest, that in reality, how our clients define conservative is more like the way we do and a lot less like the way most advisors do. I think it's time now to introduce our guest, kind of sort of a television star in his own right, and that's Wes Wood, president of Wood Financial Group, a retirement income store located just outside of Nashville. Wes is also the host of the Retirement Income Show, which airs every Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. on News Channel 5 in Nashville. Wes, we feel blessed today to have you gracing us with your presence. Great to have you here.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dave. Always a pleasure to be here.
Hey, Wes, don't forget about me. You're here with me, too.
Oh, and thanks, Jeff, as well. Yes.
Hey, congratulations on your new show in Nashville. That is so awesome. So right out of the gate, I want to start asking some questions, though. Tell me at what age do you think people should start investing for income? What does that transition occur?
Yeah, well, actually, I call it the transitional years. So typically 5 to 10 years away from retirement is a good time. You know, when the kids are out of the house, Social Security is right around the corner. A lot of people make the mistake from taking their savings and converting it to income once they retire, but really need to get it done at least 5 to 10 years before retirement so you can make sure that the portfolio is now aligned with those goals to generate income. So that's typically what we want to do is during those transitional years.
Sure. And once your clients get involved in investing for income and they've been doing it for a little bit of time or a little while, how do you transition them from, let's say, being a scorekeeper to being an income scorekeeper? And what I mean by that is the arithmetic rate of return folks will look at, oh, geez, where's my account value at? What did I earn this year? How do you overcome those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, really, it's just focusing on income. So once people, make the shift from growth to income, there is somewhat of a learning curve of understanding where their returns are coming from. But clear as day, right there on the investment statement that we use, it shows how much income they're generating. And once people realize that, hey, this is like a piece of rental property, not like raw land. This rental property is generating a return, not in the form of growth, but in the form of interest and dividends or rental income in that analogy there. So really just focusing on, hey, here's how much income this portfolio is now generating. And what's funny is that once people start looking at that, they realize that, hey, the account value is not nearly important as how much money it's actually generating in the form of interest and dividends.
That's a really good point, because if you had a piece of real estate that was vacant and you were hoping that would grow just on the appreciation, is it better to have that as an option or have an actual tenant in there paying you rent? And what are they going to say every time, Wes?
Yeah, well, obviously the tenant in there paying rent.
That's exactly right. So Dave, that's all I have for him. Do you have anything for him?
It's 30 seconds, Wes. What motivated you to become an income specialist and now to work towards your mission of educating through television and radio, pretty much all of Nashville and greater parts of Tennessee, in fact, about why this is so important? What's your motivation?
Well, it started kind of right out of the gate. When I graduated college and with an accounting and finance degree, I started working in this general industry right out of the gate. So that's been now 17, coming on 18 years ago. And if you remember, that would have been 2003, literally at the bottom of the stock market. One thing that I noticed right out of the gate is that I was working with a lot of pretty bullish brokers with some of their retired clients. And, this is the first time they've experienced such a large crash in the market. And they were constantly liquidating the portfolio to give their clients money.
It's the worst. You don't need to have an accounting degree to figure out that's the worst. But yep. So you were, just like a lot of people got stuck in growth because they got in the business in the 80s and 90s. Right. You got stuck in income because you got in during the bursting of the tech bubble. So Wes, I love it. As usual, it's great to have you on here. We need to call it a wrap here for today. And we're going to take a commercial break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about what I like to call the financial silent killer. Stay with us. I'm David Scranton. We'll be right back on The Income Generation.
For behind-the-scenes photos, retirement planning tips, and upcoming giveaways, follow The Income Generation Show on Facebook. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch video clips, guest interviews, and to catch up on past episodes.
Welcome back to The Income Generation. I'm David Scranton, and of course, it's good to be here with all y'all today because we're discussing the importance of avoiding the most common mistakes that people make in preparing for retirement. So far, we've discussed the importance of goal setting and making sure you have a strategy that's right for your goals. We also talked about the difference between bonds and bond mutual funds and making sure that you stay away from that potential retirement trap. But there's another mistake that can get you in trouble if you're not careful, and that's underestimating inflation, what I often refer to as the financial silent killer. Ever since the end of the Great Depression, inflation has been a permanent part of the U.S. economy. In fact, from the start, it's created an incredible challenge for workers trying to estimate how much income they need during retirement. Now, of course, most people know that they have to factor in inflation in some way, shape, or form, but tend to underestimate it. And you end up paying a big price for that mistake later on. You see, when you're employed, you can usually count on a periodic raise of some sort, cost of living raise in your paycheck, and hopefully more than that. And once you're retired, you have to create that inflation hedge yourself. And if you don't do it accurately, the imbalance can take an enormous toll. A toll that gets bigger and bigger the longer you live. So let's say the average inflation rate over time that's published is about 3%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, right? But in reality, it's probably closer to 5%. Why? Because I've always felt that the government has an axe to grind when it comes to reporting data about inflation. If they lowball the number, it means they can spend less money on cost of living hikes and federal pensions, as well as on your Social Security check. So here's the truth. Inflation can spike to very high rates. It can spike above 5 and be well over 7% on average, as it was in the 70s, and 5.5% as it was in the early 80s. At least those are the official lowball numbers. So mathematically, here's why this is so important. At 5% inflation over 30 years, you would actually need 4 times the income on your last day of retirement compared to what you needed on the first day. At 7%, you need 8 times as much income the last day of retirement compared to the first day. And that's just counting on really just regular general inflation. Now, the situation gets even dicier when you factor in healthcare inflation, which is something that people really tend to underestimate. Healthcare expenses rise at a much faster and steeper rate than the rate of general inflation. And you don't need me to tell you that the older you get, the more health care you typically need. Now we're moving on to another one of your questions. Todd from Illinois, as I like to say, says, Dave, aren't there certain kinds of investments that are supposed to give you a so-called inflation hedge? In theory, yes. But in times of high inflation, most traditional investments do poorly. Even people say, well, real estate's a great inflation hedge. But in periods of high inflation, mortgage rates go up, and that hurts real estate values too, as well as it hurts stock values and bond values and virtually everything. So whereas there's some things that can help you a little bit, it's not as simple as it sounds. It's not like there's some magical investment that keeps up with inflation. Even gold, right? The old rule of thumb was gold. But we've been off the gold standard now for almost 50 years as a country. So you really can't even count on gold as an inflation hedge anymore. That's the bottom line. And again, be sure to send me your retirement questions by emailing us at askdave@theretirementincomeStore.com. So Jeff, I'm sure you agree, gold, can't really count on gold anymore as the big inflation hedge, right?
Dave, I remember those days when gold used to be the standard to keep up with inflation. But gold's overpriced today, and there are other ways for us to keep up with inflation, particularly in income investing. So tell us how you explain that to folks.
Yeah, great question. It's funny because, just reinvesting of interest and dividends creates an inflation hedge, and people lose sight of that. So part of the key is to have investments in there in your portfolio, not just all bonds and preferreds, but things where their income can increase to create a natural inflation hedge, but also ideally not to spend all the income, because by reinvesting interest and dividends, you're essentially growing your future income the old-fashioned way through reinvestment And people lose sight of the fact that that still provides an inflation hedge.
Well, reinvesting for income, Dave, is very, very important because we have other types of inflation like healthcare inflation. That's almost a whole separate issue compared to the general inflation we're discussing when it comes to what affects you in retirement.
Right, so healthcare inflation goes up closer to 6% per year on average, which means that now instead of you needing 4 times the cost in 30 years, it's 4 times the cost in closer to 25 years, 24 years. And the reason it's so important is because if you invest for income and you preserve your principal throughout your life, and then you come to a point where you need home health care, but your principal is intact, now at a ripe old age, hopefully in your late 80s, maybe early 90s, now you can start to spend down the principal to keep the freedom of being able to stay in the comfort of your home as opposed to being forced into a convalescent facility, which, as you know, Jeff, all of our clients want to stay home as long as they possibly can. But it only works if you haven't touched your principal until you have that medical issue later in life. And we'll be talking about that in just a little bit. But right now, it's time to welcome our next guest, Jeff, and that is Drew Pelton, president and founder of Drew Pelton Investment Services, a retirement income store located right in Baton Rouge. Drew, thanks for being back on the show, and thanks so much for being a good friend of the income generation.
Thanks for having me, Dave. And Jeff, looking forward to the show.
Drew, it's great to see you all the way from Baton Rouge. So welcome aboard here. However, we want to focus on what we're discussing today. And we see a lot of clients that we work with have complacency issues, especially at these stock market peaks or based on the amount of money that we have. How do you deal with your clients and making them uncomplacent, let's say?
Well, one of the big things I have found myself saying in my seminars, my presentations, and to people when they come in the office is, it's your money, it's your retirement, and it's your life. And you've got to embrace that and not be just going down the path of investing in the stock market only when the market's up, because too many people are complacent and too many people are thinking, oh, all is well right now, and they're really not prepared for the future.
Great point, Drew. Inflation is in all the airwaves today. That's all we hear about inflation. We've seen gas go up $1.30 a gallon since the November election. How do we deal with inflation? How do you deal with inflation with your customers when you approach that issue?
Well, there's got to be an investment strategy that includes growth, that includes predictability in income. And most of that has to do with not just being subject to the stock market. You've got to look at investments that are outside the stock market, bond and bond-like types of instruments that can give you the predictability and dependability of income. And then you've got to have some growth, assuming you're not taking all your money from dividends and interest, you're going to have some growth. So unquestionably, you've got to factor in all the numbers to make sure that you're getting ahead and you've got more money and more return than the monies you're taking out.
You're talking about organic growth, reinvestment of interest and dividends. I get that completely. So 30 seconds, real quick. When somebody's complacent because they've got 7-figure money, I deal with a lot of average folks. You have a lot of people come in that have $1 million, $2 million, $3 million. How do you keep them from being complacent, especially when you know the long-term effects of inflation and maybe they don't really understand?
Well, one of the things is to talk about market history, to explain to them that if they need income at the top of the market that might be acceptable to them, that if they need that same amount of income along the way, meaning when markets are going down, they're going to have to sell more shares of their stock portfolio to get the same income, which means when the market goes back up, they're going to have less in their portfolio because they had to sell more shares to get the same income.
And that's a big problem because now you're essentially you're dealing with inflation with your living costs, but your assets are deflating, much like Tom Brady's legendary football there a few years ago. So, Drew, thanks so much for being with us here on The Income Generation. We really appreciate having you back.
Well, thank you for having me, both Dave and Jeff. I appreciate it.
Now you be sure to stay with us because right after the break, we're going to address two other common mistakes, and that is the decision of when to take Social Security, the right way and wrong way to do it, and also not being prepared for required minimum distributions. I'm David Scranton, and we'll be right back on the Income Generation. I'm David Scranton. When it came time for my mom to retire, one simple mistake forced her to work years longer than she should have. And that's why I started the Retirement Income Store, to help hardworking Americans 55 and over plan for the retirement they deserve. I couldn't help my mom, but maybe I can help you.
If you're 55 or older, please claim our free Retirement Income Kit, chock full of information you need to know to get steady income during your retirement. Call 866-314-7227, online at the Retirement.
Welcome back to the Income Generation. I'm David Scranton, and of course, it's great to be here with you today, talking about some of these most common mistakes that people make in their retirement plans. And we covered a lot so far. Now we're going to look at the most common mistake that retirees end up making, and that is spending down principal, or at least it's perhaps the most deadly. You see, spending any principal during retirement is a slippery slope, especially when you consider today's longevity rates. And the fact that they mean that you probably have to prepare for 30 years or more of retirement income. And that offers up a really good metaphor to explain the dangers of spending down principal. Okay? Think about how you choose to finance your home. Many people, that's a 30-year mortgage, right? So how does a 30-year mortgage work? Well, when you first start making payments, you're not really paying back any principal at all, right? It's mostly interest. Just a tiny bit goes to principal, but as the years go down and the balance gets paid down, you pay a little less interest, a little more principal. And that process continues until after 30 years, the mortgage is paid off. Now imagine the same process in reverse. Let's take a pool of savings worth, to use a round number, $1 million. And let's say it generates 5% interest, which is $50,000 a year. If you take even a tiny bit more than that $50,000 of interest, just a little bit, your $1 million in savings can be depleted within 30 years. And in very much the same way that mortgage is miraculously paid off in 30 years. So how do retirees end up making this mistake? Well, several ways. But at the end of the day, it all boils down to not having an asset allocation specifically designed to minimize the risk of spending down principal. And having the right allocation is especially critical when it comes to making decisions around retirement issues. Decisions like Social Security, or satisfying required minimum distributions. You see, with RMDs, once you hit age 72, you have to start taking out about 4% per year. And the important question becomes, are your investments generating enough interest or dividends to satisfy those? Or are you letting the government force you to take these RMDs from principal? Okay. Now, let's get back to Jeff. But before we do, I want to take one quick question from you. We have Jen from Florida that says, if my money keeps growing in the stock market, doesn't that offset or eliminate the risk of spending principal? Well, Jen, great question. And the answer is, it depends how lucky you are. Are you feeling lucky, in the words of Clint Eastwood, right? So if you retired in 1990 and the stock market went straight up for a decade, then sure, you could take some principal each year, sell some shares, spend the money, and it'll grow back the following year. But if you retired 10 short years later in the year 2000, where we had zero growth in the market for 13 years, the first 13 years of the 21st century, right? Then the answer is no. You would have spent down about half your principal in those 13 years. So most people find they don't really want to gamble when it comes to their retirement or leave it up to luck. But be sure to send me your retirement questions by emailing us at askdave@theretirementincomeStore.com. So, Jeff, I think you thought you were going to escape without me making a comment of this, but that's a very lovely pink shirt that you're wearing there today. And it takes a special man to wear a pink shirt on television the way you're doing. And I'm pleasantly surprised that you have what it takes.
Well, it's nice to see that you noticed, Dave, but real men wear pink. I challenge you to wear one.
Yes.
So, Dave, listen, you mentioned Social Security. And so I've seen folks do a lot of goofy things, taking money out of their portfolio to allow their Social Security to defer, waiting too long. How can Social Security pose a risk to your principal if you have the wrong investment allocation?
Well, if you delay Social Security at age 70 to get the maximum, but you retire early, then you've got to have conservative investments in your portfolio so you can spend down a little bit of principal. You know, I always poo-poo spending down principal, but if you're doing it for just a few years waiting for Social Security to kick in, it might be okay. And if you take Social Security early because you retire early, well then we know you can't even retire off full Social Security, let alone a reduced benefit. So then you need to have your portfolio earning more interest and dividends to supplement that reduced benefit. So it almost doesn't matter when you take it, your investments need to be aligned with your strategy.
No doubt that's correct, Dave, that's for sure. But we see the same thing with required minimum distributions from IRAs. We've seen, and you've seen, multiple situations where people end up cannibalizing their nest egg.
Yeah, and there's really no way not to do it. I mean, if you're in the 30% tax bracket, even if you say, I'm going to save my entire RMD, I'm not going to spend it, you're only saving 70 cents on the dollar. The other third's going out the window. But it's worse than that because, you know, then you're handcuffed and you feel your entire life after age 72 that, gosh, I can't spend this money. Whereas people find it's liberating if they can generate that RMD from interest and dividends, keep their principal intact. Now each year it's like a renewable resource. They can decide, do I want to save this RMD, or do I want to redo the kitchen, or do I want to help out in my grandchild's college? You know, you have almost an infinite number of choices. And to talk with us about some of these choices, it's now time to introduce our next guest, our good buddy, Jeff, Brad Williams, president of Brad Williams Financial Services, a retirement income store in Huntsville, Alabama. Thanks so much, Brad, for being back with us on The Income Generation.
Oh, it's great being here, Dave. Thanks for asking me.
Brad, it's great to see you all the way from Huntsville. I'm going to hit you right out of the gate, though, with this one. And so, does it make sense if you're taking out required minimum distributions or you're taking out income from your IRA in retirement, does it make sense to liquidate assets to do that?
Well, no, it doesn't, Jeff, simply because when the market's going up, that would work real well. But when the market's going down, you're eating into the principal and you're basically having a cancerous growth on your retirement accounts.
And so we also see a lot of issues, Brad, over here in Florida, and I know Dave has seen them, and you've seen them too, about making the right Social Security option. I saw somebody recently who was deferring their Social Security and taking out the same income from their portfolio, so they were cannibalizing. Has that ever run into you ever run into that before?
Periodically I do, and you know, you got to run those numbers, but so that Social Security should be a good foundation for your retirement income, and then the rest should come on top of it. So running those numbers is real important, and not just shooting from the hip.
Well, shooting from the hip, or let's say you just allowing Social Security to increase and taking money out of your savings makes no sense. So nobody should ever do that, correct?
Well, as far as waiting on Social Security, you know, if you have income sources, but if what you're saying is waiting to take Social Security and then eating into your IRA, no, I would say, no, you shouldn't do that.
You know, it's funny, Brad, you've got some real smart people, a lot of engineers over there in Huntsville that you deal with. So real quick, what's the most common psychological thing that you come across in talking to a lot of smart do-it-yourself investors who may think they've got it all figured out, but are missing something important?
Well, I think one of the main things is understanding market cycles, and they look at the last 10 years or so and the market's going up, and you know, they have that normalcy bias that says things are going to continue as they are, and market cycle. So when that market starts going down and they're pulling that money out, it's going to be disastrous. So understanding that's really critical.
And that's why it's so important to get them to go from growth to income in terms of a mindset in a timely fashion. Brad, thanks so much for being back with us again on The Income Generation. You know, as I said at the top of the show, we all make mistakes, and some are easy to shrug off, but others have a lasting impact. Mistakes you make when it comes to retirement planning usually fall into the latter category. But here's the good news. All of us can learn not just from our own mistakes, but from the mistakes of others. In fact, in more than 30 years as a financial advisor, each Jeff and myself, as well as many of those you heard today, have learned that there's certain mistakes that can absolutely sabotage your retirement plan more frequently than others. And as we've seen today, these include things like not identifying your retirement goals, or blindly following cookie cutter financial rules and strategies that may not be made or tailor-made to your specific goals, not understanding the important differences between bonds and bond funds, underestimating the effects of inflation, and of course, not having an asset allocation that helps you minimize your risk of spending down principal. In fact, investing for income can oftentimes help you avoid these costly mistakes along with many others. Thanks for joining me once again here on The Income Generation, and thanks of course to Jeff Small, as well as all of our guests. We've had a blast here today with you. If you're close to or you're in retirement and you're concerned about your money, it's essential you stay informed and up to date. And as you know, right here is where you could do it on The Income Generation. I'm David Scranton, and we'll see you next week.